I lead a team of analysts that's focused on providing thought leadership to government contractors. So we are responsible for analyzing, you know, federal budgets, policy, anything impacting acquisition, anything impacting certain technology procurements, professional services procurements. And so we're the strategic analyst looking at the entire forest, giving context to then the trees and the roots of the trees that the other parts of GovWin are responsible for. So together, it's a pretty comprehensive picture of the market. Oh gosh, if we look back at 2025, there are many um, kind of parallel and competing forces shaping the market. I would say the biggest ones are really around acquisition reform. And so there's a lot of things that kind of fit under that umbrella, from, the FAR 2.0, or the revolutionary FAR overhaul effort, that's really kind of simplifying and changing the rules and how contractors engage with agencies. And that adds in some additional complexity in the way that has evolved. We have kind of the newish role of GSA in terms of, especially for IT contractors, but all kinds of contractors across the board that provide kind of those common goods and services. That landscape that we had already seen evolving with category management got fueled significantly. Gosh, DOD is kind of similarly kind of evolving, looking at acquisition form and the unique requirements they have, the federal workforce. I mean, it goes on and on. So, I was telling someone there's no part of the contracting ecosystem that has gone unchanged. And so for 2026, we now are in that phase of like where the policy and the strategies for policies was 2025, and 2026 is now like, okay, these things are in place now, rubber meeting the road. This is kind of the first year of really understanding what this new normal looks like. Think shutdown preparedness is really all about portfolio and pipeline risk analysis. So whenever there's anything that interrupts the flow of funding or the compliance requirements or the types of contracts that agencies are going to be putting out there needs to be this continual risk assessment, which it's probably more frequently needed now than in previous years, right? Because so many things are changing. So really the preparedness is, whenever there is a shutdown or a continuing resolution or something, looking at how does this impact our portfolio? So that's the stuff we already have, the contracts that we're running now. Does this change compliance requirements and reporting, who we report to, what the funding looks like, long term, all of that. But then also the new stuff they're pursuing, the pipeline, does this change? Are there changes to an agency's acquisition strategy that changes what this requirement looks like now? Are there new requirements emerging that will change what the government is asking for? So during a shutdown, you really have to think about, okay, how do I approach this bid during a shutdown? And the answer is you meet all the deadlines. You act like the shutdown hasn't happened when it comes to pipeline. But when it comes to portfolio, you really have to look at the type of work. Is the type of work in the mix of that? Are there some work that's exempt? And so your engagement looks different if you're exempt, because that means you can continue to do the work and then work on getting paid for that once the shutdown is over, versus you're not exempt. You have to shut everything down, and now you have to deal with, what do I do with my employees to kind of keep them engaged? And is there somewhere else I can put them? So unfortunately, a lot of companies in the market have had a lot of practice in preparing for shutdowns, but I think some get caught off guard. And I always say, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. So I think this ongoing, consistent, and frequent assessment of portfolio and pipeline risk has to be, that has to be a well-oiled machine, because especially when you have a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity in the market like we do now. I would say with anything that we talk about, down acquisition reform, all of that stuff, there is a special concern for small businesses because depending on what it is, they have to kind of figure out with their limited resources how to navigate that, how to weather storms, how to kind of keep the machine going during a shutdown, how to get information from primes during different, a shutdown or, changes in prime strategy and all of those things. So yeah, the market in general is more challenging for small businesses just because they have to balance, like they're smaller, so they're more agile and they can pivot faster. But being small means you don't necessarily have all the resources that larger companies do to kind of weather and kind of take on the added costs that come along with a lot of these things like shutdowns and change in agency strategies and canceled bids and changing the requirements and all those things. So yeah, that's always a concern. Well, we just saw that I think over 1,000 small businesses, during that audit had their contracts canceled, I guess, for non-responsiveness. And then, we know Department of Defense has initiated its own audit of the 8A program, particularly with a focus on sole sourcing. And I remember early on in the administration, I was saying, with 8A, there's a couple of things to think about. One is that, the program itself is statutory, so they can't outright kind of cancel the program. But I, had concerns about, but they could starve it somehow, or they could change the policies and kind of the contours of the program. And that's what we're seeing now, in terms of SBA budget potential and these audits and kind of the scrutiny, trying to identify, waste, fraud, and abuse and all that. There's that piece in particular around 8A, but then the bigger thing that I've seen over the course of the year is this idea, which kind of leans towards um, kind of streamlining and watering down the intent of 8A, which is the what is a clear intent to me of the administration is just to create one big small business pool. Everyone's kind of competing the same. So taking out any additional disadvantages or any of those things, I can see from some of the policy things, the small business targets, changes to small business size standards that are used to determine if a business is small and what they can compete for. I think all of those things combined create this picture of, wanting just one big small business industrial base where they're all just competing against each other, which means that you're going to see very small companies competing against bigger small companies, right? And so it kind of takes some of the layers and hierarchy away, and everybody's kind of just competing for a small business award. So that can be more challenging. It's good for some of the bigger small businesses that were on the cusp of not being small anymore, like they had grown. And so size standards increases are great for them because then they can continue to compete as small, but then the smalls are now looking at even more companies that are still in that competitive pool. So it can be challenging. I remember looking at this after the first 100 days. I had to stop counting, but the first 100 days, I believe it was like 143 executive orders that were passed compared to say like, 60, 70 in every previous administration. And so it's very much a kind of governing through executive order. I would say the most impactful for contractors ties back to kind of your first question, which is the executive order directing the revolutionary fire overhaul, the executive order that kind of made GSA executive agent over common goods and services procurement and IT GWACs and, those spending under those. There were a couple, there was one that kind of really set the stage for DOD and their acquisition reform and setting a lot of parameters around, cost and milestones and staying on schedule. And so there's been a lot of all at the same time. I think just the acquisition framework that we were used to before 2025, every corner of that seems to have been shifted around. So I would say those are kind of the big ones. I would say some others, depending on where a contractor lives, and where their funding comes from. But any executive orders that kind of pushed agencies to look at spending. So some of the, the creation of DOGE, really had an impact. And although the formal DOGE institution is no longer, DOGE is kind of embedded in every agency still. So, and that idea and the concept behind DOGE of like close scrutiny of spending and quick terminations and all of that is still around. So I would say those have been significantly impactful for contractors and kind of the cornerstones of what acquisition looks like now. There's a lot of policies in place now to try to speed up adoption of AI in federal agencies. And I think two benefits, obviously, and this is not new to this administration, but the idea of AI kind of being able to augment and speed up, mission initiatives and the data needed to make mission and strategic decisions. That was kind of already in place. So I see that ramping up with a lot of the policies of this Trump administration did kind of loosen up some of the, I guess, the strictness, so to speak, of the Biden administration policies when it came to this. So the idea is to make it easier for agencies to adopt AI. And there's also programs like OneGov and GSA that has set up contracts to make it easier for agencies to, quickly get some kind of AI. So I think that the mission part is one thing. I think AI is also going to be really important for automation because of the reduction in force and the deferred resignation and kind of the major decline in the federal workforce. And so the mission's still there. So now you have to look at, well, how do we meet these mission with fewer people? So I think on the government side, it's really speeding up adoption. Part of kind of the guardrails around that, though, for contractors that sell AI to the government will be around kind of data integrity that's being used to train AI on, but also security. And so I think any, push for that has to kind of marry those two things to the mission in order for it to kind of be an attractive investment for government. And then switching to contractor side, so we asked contractors a lot about this in our annual Deltek Clarity report, which will be coming soon. But what we continue to see is that contractors are continuing to invest in AI across most functions of their business, from business development into, their own procurement, HR, across the board. So I think we're going to continue to see that, but there's this interesting intersection, especially when it comes to BD and AI, of what to invest in, how to invest in it, and making sure there's clear assessment of the risks of how they use it. So we think a lot about that here at GovWan. We've got an AI proposal tool coming, and a really sharp lead on that project to really think about that space of like using AI to be able to respond to proposals faster and pull in more information to make those responses more robust and comprehensive, but also in a way where the government doesn't look at that and think that AI did the bidding and not the contractor, right? You have to maintain that authenticity that this is us, and AI was the support for that, and also the tactical stuff of making sure that there's a high level of due diligence when they do use it, that they're not just running with whatever AI says. As great as it is, it does mess up sometimes. So just a lot of due diligence and making sure that you're checking everything that you're using from AI. And then one small other piece of that was interesting that we saw with a big contract like NASA's SOUP, where, and I don't know, this may become standard across many agencies where, NASA said, hey, if you're going to use AI for your bids, there needs to be transparency. Where did you use it? How did you use it? And we may see more of that request coming up in RFPs, because the government knows contractors are going to use it because they're using it, but they want to be very clear about what are you using it for. So I think there's opportunities and risks there. So contractors have to really be on top of really thinking that out. And then on top of that is figuring out really good metrics to determine whether AI is working. Is it worth it? Is it working well for them? Is it driving the efficiencies that they're looking for? It's pretty ingrained in government. It's just a lot of the policy stuff has been kind of guiding. There's some that's more conservative in previous administrations, and then a little bit of loosening in this one. And so, keeping an eye on kind of, what that balance is. So, for example, the Biden administration had much more policy around data integrity and making sure there's no bias in the data being used for these things, and where's the data coming from and all of that. And I think there's a little bit of loosening of that in the current administration. Not that there's no care for it there, but you can see where levers are being pulled in terms of how restrictive to be in one area versus another. Gosh, I think cybersecurity is probably an area where there's an opportunity for competitive differentiation. I mean, we have, CMMC, that's been around for a few years, but I do think that even though it's required for some companies, there's different tiers to it, of course. I won't go into all that, but it's required for DoD. But I think that there's still an opportunity to kind of show above and beyond to set themselves apart. And then also the civilian side of the government doesn't have kind of a formal CMMC type thing, but they're definitely watching. And so even if, CMMC level security isn't required in the same way as it is in defense, showing that you have that capability on the civilian side is definitely, something special there. So whether you're selling cybersecurity or you're selling something else, there's still a cybersecurity expectation in the government. So whatever you're doing, whatever you're delivering, there should be a security by design component to that. And I think the technologies around that are something that we're going to continue to see have a high focus on them, especially in DoD with the kind of warfighter readiness. But I think government wide, that's always kind of been a priority. And I will also say then, kind of related to AI, but we look at it as a different market, which is big data, which has a lot of things underneath that, but it's like data management, analysis support, there's all kind of, tools around the data that is really, really important to feed into AI, and have the infrastructure and the data there to support that. And, some agencies are further along than others when it comes to that. That's why we kind of see different pace of AI adoption. A lot of it is because they still have work to do on kind of cleaning up that data, breaking down stovepipes between data so that it can be leveraged better. So I would say those are kind of the big buckets. I will also say that cloud computing is like the de facto way that agencies had been and will continue to modernize. So I think we'll continue to see whatever hasn't already been migrated to kind of a cloud environment. That's going to be the push because that's the easiest way and the way that agencies have been modernizing their infrastructure and their tools. I mean, there's tons of challenges to migrating to the cloud. I think one of the biggest ones has been that there is a lot of stovepiping and kind of data and software reconciliation that has been ongoing for a while, where, there's such fragmentation that they have to kind of do this audit to figure out, okay, what do we have? What do we really need? What should go into the cloud? And so that takes a lot of time. I mean, Army has been doing that for, a while, and many other agencies as well. And also, I think just the culture in the government, you do have aging infrastructure. And there's a risk aversion because when you are migrating, the government approach is we have to keep both of these things running at the same time until we are completely confident that the cloud can handle everything we need to handle. And there's fear, and risk of, mission failures or whatever. And so sometimes there's more cost involved, and that's a fear and lack of resources when they know there's a certain period of time where we need to have the legacy stuff running with the cloud and new stuff. And that can be daunting. They may not have the budget for it. And so that means they have to kind of prioritize and progress at a different pace towards cloud, migrations because of that. Say, don't be caught off guard. So this means you have to stay aware of all of these developments and changes. And lucky for you, that's what government does. That's our job. But I think that, preparedness is going to be really important. And even if they just focus just on one piece of what's going on, I would say understanding the FAR revision is critical, not just because there's changes, But because so much of what in the past was required is now at the discretion of contracting officers. And so what that means is that agency to agency approaches to acquisition may be different. Within an agency, bureau to bureau may be different. Within all of that, contract to contract could be different. That's a lot more work for contractors to figure out, okay, how is this particular contract going to move forward? Because the discretion that the CO and the agencies have to how they're going to move forward that acquisition requires you to kind of almost, to tweak many different levers, contract to contract. And even the contracting officers that used to give you that comfort may not even be there anymore. So I would say preparedness in terms of really, really getting a tight handle on what their agency customers look like now from all angles, mission, workforce, operational priorities, all of the things. That customer intel is going to be critical moving forward.